Well, we'll start with the book of Ezra. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah, along with Esther, incidentally, altogether cover about 100 years, and they close the Old Testament history, the historical books. Many people feel that the history between the close of these books and the New Testament, the 400 years that are involved, are called the silent years. But they overlook the fact that those years are in the Bible. They're written in advance. If you look at Daniel chapter 11, verses 5 through 35, it lays out the tensions between the Ptolemies, the Seleucid Empire, that cover those 4 centuries, for what it's worth. But it's interesting that the books of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles closed with the southern kingdom going into captivity. As you may recall, about almost a century earlier, the northern kingdom got not only captured, but distributed, dissolved. So there is no more northern kingdom. And again, don't get confused by these myths about the 10 lost tribes, because the faithful in the northern kingdom had migrated south, and the unfaithful, the idolaters in the southern kingdom, in large measure, migrated north. So there's an infusion. And you'll begin to see some of that even when they return from captivity, as we'll see here. But what we call these books after the Babylonian captivity, the post-exile. The captivity of Babylon, of Judah, the southern kingdom, in the Babylonian captivity is sometimes called the exile. There are certain prophets that are pre-exile, exile prophets during the exile, Ezekiel, Daniel, Jeremiah. There are certain prophets that are post-exile. In other words, they're prophets, their primary ministry is after they return from the captivity. Habakkuk and Zechariah. And the Italian prophet, Malachi, comes in. So we're going to discover after the Babylonian captivity, as they come back, they're going to be both under the protection and also the assistance, interestingly enough, of 3 Persian kings: Cyrus, Darius, or Darius, depending on how you want to pronounce it, and Artaxerxes. Those 3 guys. There's more kings, but those are the key guys, and they're very prominent in their participation in God's program here. And there's going to be terrific leadership from Zerubbabel on the civil side and Joshua, the priest Joshua, not the Joshua of the Pentateuch. This is a different Joshua. He's a priest. And, of course, Ezra and so forth. And the big challenge of the book of Ezra is to come back to they're going to be released and come back to the land and build the temple. The first 6 chapters of the 10 chapters that make up Ezra covers events in the first 2 or 3 years of the reign of Cyrus. We'll talk about Cyrus in a minute. And also the first 6 years of Darius. The last 4 chapters will record events of the first part of Artaxerxes. And Artaxerxes the first is a very, very key king for our interests here. There's a whole bunch of kings, Persian kings, that are not even mentioned. Cambyses, Myrtus, and there's one verse about Xerxes, and he was the king during Esther. That's a whole other thing we'll talk about when we get to that appropriate place. There's also some very important historical events that are not mentioned. The Persians made 2 huge but very futile efforts to conquer Greece that set the revenge that Alexander will later repay and sets up the Greek Empire and so forth. We're going to discover, as Ezra opens, that the Jews have just seen the overthrow of Babylon. We're going to talk a little bit about that before we get into the chapter. That's the overthrow of this hated Babylonian Empire in 539 BC by Cyrus the Persian. And Daniel has just been put into place of honor by Darius the Mede. Daniel's a strange guy. Daniel is deported early in the captivity as a teenager. And he rises to prominence in the Babylonian Empire through the interpretation of the dream and so forth. But when Babylon is conquered by its enemies, Daniel again, now much older, in his twilight years, rises to power again. Very interesting, one of the most interesting careers you'll find on the planet Earth, the career of Daniel. And so I encourage you to study his life if you haven't. And he's going to end up being appointed to rule over the Babylonian territories, in a sense. He's going to be right. And that's where he's going to be put in charge of the hereditary priesthood that sets up the king. The Magi. And very interesting background. But let's talk a little bit about, we obviously closed the previous historical books by the tribe of the household of Judah being taken into captivity and by Babylon. Jeremiah and Ezekiel during that time and subsequent preached that this is the hand of God and so on. They threw Jeremiah in prison to treat him as a traitor, but he was right. He was telling what God told him to tell him. But they all do, as you know, they went through the 3 deportations we talked about before. The Babylonian captivity was predicted to be 70 years. But now we get to near the end of those 70 years, and a guy by the name of Cyrus II, he later becomes known as Cyrus the Great, and he's the founder of the Achaemenid Persian Empire that continued for 2 centuries before Alexander the Great took him. So we're in the book of Ezra, session 1, chapters 1 through 3. And as you look at the timeline, we're obviously moving at the tail end of the monarchy. We're in the post-exile period. And we've seen the Babylonian Empire rise. We're going to see it fall. It'll be followed by the Persian Empire. It'll be followed by the Greek Empire. And the span of our books will embrace both of those. And to some extent, because Artaxerxes will be at the beginning of the Greek period. And then, of course, comes the Roman Empire, and we get to the New Testament period. And it's interesting, remember, in the Greek period is when the Septuagint translation, the Old Testament was translated into Greek 3 centuries before Christ was born. So all of this stuff is in black and white 3 centuries before Christ's ministry. That'll become very important as we get into some of the other details. And the last time we talked about the fact the Babylonian captivity took part was in 3 sieges, and the servitude of the nation starts with the first siege. It was going to be 70 years. And it is terminated by Cyrus conquering Babylon and issuing a decree. We want to understand that a little bit before we get into Ezra. And I think, and of course, that decree of Cyrus is when the Persians conquer the Babylon, starts the period we call the Persian Empire. Now, the 3rd siege is that caused the desolations of Jerusalem, the city. Both the servitude of the nation and the desolation of Jerusalem were both predicted to be 70 years long, and many people jumped to the conclusion, by not being precise, that they're simply synonyms. The desolation of Jerusalem, the Babylonian captivity is spoken of as 70 years, but it's actually in 2 parts. The servitude of the nation, which starts at the first siege, ends with the decree of Cyrus. It's 70 years to the day. The desolations of Jerusalem started with the 3rd siege. When they kept rebelling, Nebuchadnezzar finally had it with him, and he leveled the city. Took him, and that started the desolations of Jerusalem. And it will have its termination, again, 70 years to the day, by the decree of Artaxerxes. And that triggers the prophecy that Gabriel gave Daniel in Daniel chapter 9, which triggers this fabulous 70 weeks prophecy, which nails the exact day that the Messiah would present himself to Jerusalem as a king. Very, very exciting stuff, actually. Well, Chronicles, of course, takes us up to the decree of Cyrus. Ezra is going to take us from Cyrus up to almost the decree of Artaxerxes. That's really occurs in the 2nd chapter of the book of Nehemiah. So that gives you a rough feeling of the chronology here. And Esther, incidentally, occurs between chapters 6 and 7 of Ezra. It won't be mentioned. It's a separate book. But when you start putting the pieces together, you'll discover that the whole episode in the Persian Empire that constitutes the drama of the book of Esther occurs after chapter 6, before chapter 7 of the book of Ezra. And Daniel and Ezekiel and Jeremiah are prophets of the exile. Well, Jeremiah is actually even earlier. Haggai, Zechariah, and later Malachi will be the prophets, the so-called post-exile prophets, for what it's worth. Okay, Cyrus the Great. He's the guy that established the Medo-Persian Empire because he was half of both. His father, Cambyses I, was king of Anshan. That's Eastern Elam. He's Persian, in other words, we would call Persian. His mother, Mandane, was the daughter of Astyages, the king of Media. So Cyrus had blood of both the Medes and the Persians. When you say Medes, by the way, you might think Kurds, because there are roots here that are in common. Now, in about 550 BC, he attacked his father-in-law, the highly corrupt Astyages, and his father had alienated one of his key generals, so his general threw in with Cyrus. But anyway, he captured Ecbatana, the capital, without a battle. You're going to discover, if you read his career, again and again and again, he conquers these places without firing a shot, so to speak. He had a very enlightened policy, too. He gave respect to the gods that his enemies worshipped. He didn't thrust upon them his culture, and therefore he was often welcomed by people that were favoring a regime change, if you will. So, by some of these successes, he welded the Medes and the Persians into a unified nation that continued for 200 years. We call it the Persian Empire, or some of your Bible things will call it the Medo-Persian Empire, same thing. Now, one of the things that captures our interest is the conquest of Babylon. On October 12th of 539 BC, his general, Ugabaru, captured Babylon without a battle. It's very important for you to understand this because most Bible handbooks and Bible dictionaries don't have this perception. It's very important. What the Persians did, the general sent up a division upriver. The Euphrates came through and bisected the city of Babylon. And the water from the Euphrates served as a moat around the city and also provided the city water in case of a siege. And what the Persians did is send up they got control of the widespread canal system in that region, in the plain of Shinar and so forth. At a preset signal, they diverted the Euphrates, lowering the water level. Herodotus, the Greek historian, gives us all the details. They diverted the river Euphrates into a canal upriver so that the water level dropped, as Herodotus says, to the height of the middle of a man's thigh. So they could wade in under the gates that were protecting the city. And that made the flood defenses useless and enabled them to march to the riverbed to enter by night. There were residents in Babylon that didn't even know it had been taken over for 3 days. I want you to understand that Babylon was not destroyed, it was captured. There's a big difference. Don't confuse the fall of Babylon with the destruction of Babylon. And most people do. Many of your commentaries and stuff fail to perceive this difference. And to sort of underscore what I'm saying, if you go to the British Museum in London, go see the cylinder, or the stele, if you want to, of Cyrus. And on this is a inscription, quite an extensive one, but the key words, it says, "Without any battle he entered the town, sparing any calamity. I returned to sacred cities on the other side of the Tigris, the sanctuaries of which have been ruins for a long time, and established for them permanent sanctuaries. I gathered all their former inhabitants and returned them to their habitations." This documents the fact that Cyrus allowed the slaves that he had captured when he captured Babylon to go home. In fact, he not only allowed it, he paid them to go, and he donated money for the temple. It's going to be a very key part of the opening part of Ezra. It has profound significance for you and I. It has profound significance on the immediate things you're going to read about in the newspapers over the coming months. And I'll show you why. This is the fall of Babylon. Now, you have it detailed for you from inside. You have an insider's report, not from MSNBC, but from Daniel. Because at that time, it was the king's, the king, Nabonidus was a loser. He did things abroad. He didn't even run the place. So he left his profligate son in charge, Belshazzar. And he actually was Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. But instead, as the Persians are approaching, everybody assumed that Babylon was impregnable. That's always a fatal strategy, to underestimate your enemies. So instead of defending, he throws a party for 1,000 nobles. Think about that for a moment. The room that he throws this party in has been rebuilt by Saddam Hussein. He had archaeologists several decades ago verify the foundations. He rebuilt Nebuchadnezzar's palace, and the room that this event took place is there. He used it for affairs of state in 1987. Now, the Persian army is on the near horizon. As they're throwing this party, everything quiets down when they see the fingers of a man's hand right on the wall. You know, all through the book of Daniel, there are events that have caused idioms in our language. One of those is he's seen the handwriting on the wall. We've all heard that. Most people don't know where that comes from. It comes from Daniel chapter 5. Now, the experts couldn't interpret what was on the wall. The Queen Mother, Nebuchadnezzar's widow, is around. She says, you know, there is a guy, he's in retirement, but there's a guy that had a gift for that. They called Daniel out of retirement. And they promise him all kinds of things, and he declines. Now, they don't know that while this is going on, the Persian army was able to slip through and conquer Babylon while this is going on. But they don't know that. And by the way, this raises a question. You might be interested in this. We talked about this when we talked about Isaiah 7 and so forth. Are there hidden codes in the Bible? And there's several verses in the Bible that indicate there are, and there's a number of discoveries that are not new. They were discovered by the rabbis centuries ago and are being rediscovered with the use of computers. It's the glory of God to conceal a thing, but the honor or duty of kings to search out a matter. Proverbs 25:2. We talked about Albam before. That's where you take the Hebrew letter and fold it over itself and use transpositions, substitute the matching pair to encrypt, a very simple form of what they call transposition code. There's another form of encryption called Atbash, and that's where you fold it back, you put the second half backwards. So you now have the 22 letters of Hebrew folded back on itself. And so you take the first letter and substitute the last letter, the second letter, the next to last. So you use substitutions the same way. It's called Atbash after the four letters that make up the corner. But the point is, the Talmud indicates that what happened in Daniel 5 was the reason they couldn't read it on the wall, it was encrypted using Atbash. Now, is that correct or not? I don't know, but that's the Talmudic or rabbinical belief, the handwriting on the wall. Well, so this is what they saw on the wall. If you interpret it using Atbash, it says, many, many tekel upharsin. Now, many people get, the word many, bear in mind, both the Aramaic, this is all in Aramaic, incidentally. Everything from Daniel 2 to 7 is in Aramaic because it all deals with Gentiles. Up to chapter 2 and after chapter 7, it's in Hebrew. But in any case, Aramaic is like Hebrew. It only has vowels. It only has consonants. The vowels are inferred. But many means numbered or reckoned. And what that implies is God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Or we might say your number is up, is what it implies, okay? In fact, you've heard that expression too, okay? Then tekel means weighed. Thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting, is the implication. And the last word is Perez. You'll notice in the King James it says upharsin, and that is just the connector and the plural form of it. It doesn't, that's not obvious unless you happen to know the Aramaic. But anyway, the word is Perez, which means broken or divided. And so Daniel interprets this, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. What's not obvious is the word Perez. If you infer an E sound, it means divided. If you infer an A sound, it is the word for Persians. And so that's the encryption that was on the wall that Daniel interprets. And of course, that very night, Belshazzar is slain. Now, there's another aspect of this. About 10 days later, after they've conquered Babylon, that was done by Cyrus's general and his armies. But when you get to the big day, Cyrus makes his grand entrance. He's conquered Babylon, of all things. That was an incredible symbol. And he makes his grand entrance. And according to Josephus, he tells us that Cyrus, when he makes his entrance, is greeted by Daniel. And Daniel presents him with an ancient scroll of Isaiah, which contained a personal letter to him addressing him by name, even though it was written 150 years earlier. Isn't that wild? And by the way, that letter is in your Bible. And we'll take a look at it. Isaiah had died 150 years before Cyrus was born. It's interesting that Isaiah predicts the fall of Babylon before Babylon rose to be an empire. He talks about the Persians before there's a Persian empire. Very interesting. The letter to Cyrus, you'll find this in Isaiah. It starts near the end of chapter 44, the early part of chapter 45. That saith to the deep, be dry, I will dry up thy rivers. That must have caught Cyrus's attention. That was the strategy by which he conquered Babylon. That saith of Cyrus, there's his name. Oh, wow, there's my name, he says. He is my shepherd, this is God speaking, and shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, thou shalt be built, and to thy temple, thy foundation shall be laid. A couple of 100 miles to the west, Jerusalem's in rubble. It's been that way for 70 years. Well, actually about 50 years, excuse me. But anyway, you get the idea. And it continues, the opening verse of chapter 45. Thus saith the Lord, get this, to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden, to subdue nations before him. And I will loose the loins of kings, to open before him the two-leaved gates, and the gate shall not be shut. It's exactly what he found. That's what allowed him to capture this place. Now, by the way, I have to share with you something a little bit sort of private, and I hope I won't offend anybody here. But whenever I anticipate teaching in detail Daniel chapter 5, I usually find an excuse beforehand to tell my favorite story about Lord Nelson. Yeah, some of you know where I'm going with this, right? And it's just a silly story about Lord Nelson, and he was the great, British admiral. And one day the midshipman comes into his cabin and says, Lord Nelson, there's a Spanish galleon off the port bow. He says, sound general quarters, get me my red waistcoat. Puts on his red waistcoat, they sound general quarters, they engage the Spanish galleon. And I got this all wrong, but it shouldn't be. I always tell about Spanish, it should really be Napoleon's, because I'm off, 100 years or something. Anyway, his enemy. Anyway, he sinks the enemy ship. About a week later, the midshipman comes in again. Lord Nelson, there are two enemy warships off the starboard quarter. Sound general quarters, get me a red waistcoat. So he gets his red waistcoat, sound general quarters, they engage it, they sink both ships. Next morning, the midshipman comes in. Lord Nelson, sir, request permission to ask a question. He says, granted, son, that's the way you learn. He said, I notice every time we go into battle, you always ask for your red waistcoat. Why is that, sir? That's a good question, son. You see, in case I should be hit during the battle, I don't want the crew distracted or disheartened by any sight of my blood. Oh, that made sense. You got the thing. Well, it's about a week later, midshipman comes in and said, Lord Nelson, the entire Spanish Armada is on the horizon. Says, sound general quarters, get me my brown breeches. Just a silly story. But see, it sets up something I want to point out. When you're in Daniel chapter 5, and the handwriting on the wall starts, everybody is panicked. And it says of Belshazzar that his loins were loosed and one knee smote against the other. Now, they always joke about the King James. You don't get any more graphic than that. But this expression, his loins were loosed, doesn't communicate to most of us what it's talking about. And so when I'm teaching Daniel 5, I usually say what he's doing, he's asking for his brown breeches. See? And you get the picture a little more clarity that way, don't you? You with me? Now you wonder, Chuck, what are you getting into all this for? I'll tell you why. Because that was a fulfillment of prophecy. You got to be kidding. I never miss a chance to see prophecy fulfilled. You come here to Isaiah 45, verse 1. Let's look at what God had written in Isaiah 150 years ago. Thus saith the Lord to his anointed. That's a strange word to use of a Gentile king, by the way. To Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden, to subdue nations before him. Indeed he did, one after the other. And I will loose the loins of kings. I believe that when Cyrus read that, he must have chuckled. What that tells you is the event a few days earlier when Belshazzar embarrassed himself in public was a proverb among the people. It wasn't just a subtle technicality recorded in the book of Daniel chapter 5. It became an embarrassment that was widely noted. And I'm sure it got to Cyrus. And here he's God saying, I will loose the loins of kings to open before him the two-leaved gates, and the gates shall not be shut, and so forth. He goes on, by the way. God says, I will go before thee and make the crooked places straight. I will break in pieces the gates of brass and will cut in sunder the bars of iron. And I will give thee the treasures of darkness and the hidden riches of secret places. Notice this, that thou mayest know that I, the Lord, which call thee by thy name, am the God of Israel. For Jacob, my servant's sake, and Israel, mine elect, I have called thee by thy name, I have surnamed thee, though thou hast not known me. Now, can you imagine the impact on Cyrus to find a letter that was written obviously generations before, this ancient scroll, calling him by name, describing the strategy by which he conquered Babylon, and saying, because of all that, you're going to let my people go build their temple. Cyrus was impressed, wouldn't you be? And history records what he did. We're going to see that. See, you'll understand Ezra better if you're with this background. God can say, I am the Lord and there is none else. There is no God beside me. I girded thee, though thou hast not known me. By the way, this is also a rebuttal to Zoroastrianism, the dualism that many people attribute to the Persians. Now, actually, it actually all came later, but many scholars don't know that. But in any case, God is pointing out there, we're not talking the force of having a good side or bad side, any of that. That's Zoroastrianism, that's dualism. No, beside me, there's none else. And by the way, I'm going to cut it off here because we've got to get into Ezra. But I want you to understand that if you read this letter to Cyrus, is one of the most fantastic declarations of the creation of the universe by the God that did it. Isaiah 45 is an incredible tour de force. God announcing to Cyrus who he really is. But we're going to move on. What was Cyrus's response to all this? He was obviously impressed. He freed the captives and even gave them incentives to return to their homeland and build their temple. And he'll make a proclamation that we'll skip here because we're going to see it in the text. And Ezra, by the way, is the probable author of 1st and 2nd Chronicles also, as well as Ezra and Nehemiah, which is probably one book. Some people have it in two books, but there's overlap. So Ezra's credited with establishing the canon. And there's going to be a huge return under Zerubbabel. When I say huge, it'll be almost 50,000, which is not very large in terms of the whole nation. And about 80 years later, there'll be a second group coming under Ezra himself. Ezra will enter the picture 80 years after his book begins, so to speak. And we'll talk about the kings when we get there. So let's just jump in. Here's Ezra. We finally made it, believe it or not. We are in Ezra chapter 1, verse 1. And I hope that background was useful to you. One reason I want to emphasize that Babylon fell without being destroyed is that it serves as a secondary capital for the Persians for 200 years. Then when Alexander conquers the Persians, he makes it his capital. He dies shortly thereafter, and his four generals divide up his empire. It goes all the way to India. And when they do that, they start building some other cities, and Babylon slowly atrophies. It never gets destroyed. It's off the main caravan routes as time goes on. It atrophies. But even as late as the 19th century after Christ, there are people still living there. And the point you need to understand by reading Isaiah 13 and 14 and Jeremiah 15 and 51, you'll discover that they both prophesy in great detail how Babylon is going to be destroyed like Sodom and Gomorrah. And once it's destroyed, it'll never be inhabited again. The building materials will never be reused. It's very detailed. So you got a problem. You either treat that symbolically, as some people try to do. When you get to Revelation, you can understand why they look at some of that symbolically. Let me set that aside for the moment. Clearly, the Old Testament requires Babylon to be destroyed in very specific ways that have never happened. So either dismiss that, if you're a liberal or a modernist, as some people like to call them. That's one thing. But if you take the Bible seriously, and you think that you believe that God means what he says and says what he means, the destruction of Babylon is yet future, and it's in terms of it being a major world capital. It's a city that was not mentioned during the recent war with Iraq. It's a city that's going to come front and center in world history over the coming years. I personally believe it's going to become the capital of the world under the leadership of the Antichrist. That is so preposterous, that is so absurd, that it's useful. I mean, if it was likely, you could say, well, I'm just reading into the Bible things that are on the horizon. No, that is so absurd, that's ridiculous. And that's useful for what we call testing the null hypothesis. Because as that starts to happen, it'll have impact. And as you see Babylon start to emerge, it may not happen in a few months or even a few years, but as it starts to emerge, I believe it's going to be the capital. It was the capital of the first world dictator, Nimrod, and I believe it's going to be the capital of the last world dictator, the return of Nimrod. Yes, the Antichrist comes out of the Roman Empire, but of the eastern leg, not Western Europe, as is commonly presumed. Anyway, check it out. We'll move on. Now, Ezra chapter 1, verse 1. Now, in the first year of Cyrus, the king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and put it also in writing, saying. Now, just a few more background things about Ezra itself. Josephus, Jerome, and the Talmud considered Ezra and Nehemiah as one book. So we'll sort of treat it as one book. However, see, the Hebrew Bible has them together. But there's a number of evidences within the books to indicate they were originally separate and just scrolled together. And in Ezra 2 and Nehemiah 7 have duplicate lists and so forth. But the whole thing's complicated by the way the Septuagint translation treats these books. It'll cause a lot of confusion if I don't tell you a little bit. In Septuagint, the name Esdras, E-S-D-R-A-S, refers to a number of books. First Esdras, sometimes called Esdras A, is an apocryphal book, not in the inspired canon, but still translated in the Septuagint translation. Second Esdras, sometimes called Esdras B, contains both what we call Ezra and Nehemiah. And sometimes Nehemiah is called Esdras C, or G, depending on how you look at it. You mess up the Hebrew. And the Apocrypha still has another Esdras, sometimes called Second Esdras or Fourth Esdras or whatever. So understand you may run into some confusion in labeling here if you traffic outside your classical translations here. And the book has always been regarded as canonical since even before the Septuagint, long before 200 BC. Also, Ezra is the guy that's credited with pulling together the Hebrew scriptures to what we call the Tanakh, or the Old Testament. Or I should say the Tanakh, what we call the Old Testament. And it's obviously Ezra, as a major scribe, has access to all kinds of historical documents and ties this all together. And Ezra covered two distinct time periods. The first 6 chapters, 23 years from the Edict of Cyrus to the rebuilding of the temple. And chapters 7 through 10 will deal with events after Ezra brings a second group from Babylon. Not a very large group, a couple thousand, but it's important for a lot of reasons. So, and between those will be the book of Esther, it happens. Okay, and I think we've set the historical stage pretty well. Okay, so we have Cyrus, the king of Persia. I think I've set the stage there well enough. By the time we get here, he's been reigning over his territories for about 20 years. He's been in power since 559. This is about 539 that he conquers Babylon and so forth. Okay, now I might mention that Cyrus was not a true believer in Jehovah, or the Jewish God of the Bible. But his concern was to establish buffer states around which he could enjoy some loyalty. And so he allowed people to resettle into their original countries that had been unsettled. And so he'd hoped to have all these various gods of the subject peoples praying for him and praying to his gods and so forth. So all this fulfillment, what verse 1 here emphasizes, all this is happening not because of the cleverness of Cyrus, but because of the hand of God on all of these things. And one of the things you want to notice as we go through Ezra and Nehemiah, that God is behind the scenes pulling strings. Now, the most dramatic example of that is in a book that we won't take the time to look at here that occurs between chapter 6 and 7 of Ezra, the book of Esther. In the book of Esther, it's an incredible drama of God saving the Jews from extinction, because Haman is like a Hitler-type guy who's trying to wipe out all the Jews, and he had the power to do that. And it's by God's intervention, very subtly, in very colorful ways. It's a great book. The Jews get preserved, and that makes possible not only the temple, but also the Messiah forthcoming in a few centuries. And what's interesting is God is not visible in the book of Esther. Many scholars say the name of God doesn't even appear. That's because they haven't done their homework. The name of God appears 5 different times as acrostics, and another 3 or 4 times in the form of equidistant letter sequence things. And they're really fun to get into. That's a whole other study of the book of Esther. The word Esther means something hidden, by the way. But God is behind the scenes watching over his people, even though they're not walking in faith and they're not aware of his deliverance. So you'll see that all the way through Ezra here as we go forward. And here, this is we have the phrase here, stirred up the Spirit. That expression is a favorite expression of writers in the post-exile period. We're going to see that again and again and again. I won't badger that, but there's a stylistic thing. The Holy Spirit is also very, very visible. This decree was filed in Ecbatana, where 20 years later, Darius I will discover this decree when it's contested. So this is documenting it here. So, thus saith Cyrus, the king of Persia, the Lord God of heaven hath made me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he hath charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Here is interesting. Cyrus is taking the position that because of that letter, God has charged him with the responsibility of seeing to it that the Jews get their temple. That's not because he's a believer in God in any profound sense. He is responding to the obvious circumstances here. Who is there among you of all his people? His God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, to build the house of the Lord God of Israel. He is the God which is in Jerusalem. So many scholars who see this sort of see, gee, maybe Cyrus was a real believer. No, I don't think so. I think he's just making this a politically correct posture to take. It's not that he believed in God to the exchange of the gods that he normally followed. Do you follow me? There's an important distinction there. But I also want you to notice something else as we go through the book of Ezra. The issue is going to be the rebuilding of the temple. Don't confuse the authority to rebuild the temple with the authority to rebuild the city of Jerusalem. That's going to be the issue in Nehemiah. And many people get confused about that. And it's going to be very, very important for us to understand that distinction as we go forward. Okay, verse 4. And whosoever remaineth in any place where he sojourneth, let the men of his place help him with silver and with gold and with goods and with beasts, beside the free will offering for the house of God that is in Jerusalem. Then rose up the chief of the fathers of Judah and Benjamin and the priests and the Levites and all them whose spirit God had raised to go up to build the house of the Lord which is in Jerusalem. And so Cyrus is instructing that all the neighbors of the Jews give them the equivalent of money, that is silver and gold, or material goods, or livestock. He's encouraging everyone to help these people return. And the free will offerings were for the temple, and the other gifts were for the people themselves. This is all very reminiscent of the Exodus. You remember, this is very parallel. Remember when the Jews finally got the green light to leave Egypt? They borrowed from all their friends. Everybody was glad to see them go. They gave them things. Get out of here. And they left with livestock and Cecil B. DeMille said, much cattle, and so forth. So these people are also leaving bondage and heading home. This very event was perceived by many, of course, as a miracle. But it's interesting that less than 50,000 actually take advantage of the opportunity. Others, by then, after 70 years, had gotten well ensconced. There were many people born there. They're happy where they are. They're very analogous, if you will, to many American Jews who are well established in their medical practice or legal practice or whatever they're doing. They're very well off. They don't have a draw to go and participate with the rebuilding of Israel. They'll write checks and provide financial relief, but they don't want to disrupt their lives. Now, their kids sometimes do. That's where they, so forth. But the analogy is, I think, reasonable. Now, you'll notice here it mentions Judah and Benjamin because they're the dominant players. They're not the only players. We're going to discover as we watch carefully there are many others that are not directly of Judah that are in there in the group that returned to the land. Now you should also recognize there are many people in Babylon that were deported under the Assyrian Empire. When the northern kingdom got taken over by the Assyrians and many of them were deported to other places, many of them were taken to Babylon. And conversely, from those other places brought into the northern kingdom. That's what led to the intermixing, the so-called half-Jews, the Samaritans, which we see in the New Testament. But we'll also discover that the slaves of the northern kingdom that are in Babylon get commingled with the captives of the southern kingdom. So don't get confused about that issue. Verse 6, and all they that were about them strengthened their hands with vessels of silver and gold and with goods and with beasts and with precious things beside all that was willingly offered. Also, Cyrus the king brought forth the vessels of the house of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had brought forth out of Jerusalem, and put them in the house of his gods. 70 years earlier, Nebuchadnezzar plundered Jerusalem, took all the treasures, artifacts, took them to his museum, which is just north of the palace. In fact, Belshazzar, the night that Babylon fell, One of his big mistakes was to take those. He raided the museum and took these sacred vessels for his party. That was his way of blaspheming. That was, I'm sure, one of the things that angered God. He put an end to that pretty quickly. In any case, Cyrus takes these vessels and gives them to him. He doesn't get them all because Darius later is going to pick up some that were still remaining. But he gets most of them, apparently. Even those did Cyrus the king of Persia bring forth by the hand of Midratath the treasurer, and numbered them unto Sheshbazzar the prince of Judah. And these are Persian names, of course, and the word for treasurer there happens to be not Hebrew, but a Persian word, incidentally. Verse 9, and this is the number of them, 30 chargers of gold, and 1,000 chargers of silver, and 29 knives. And it goes on with 30 basins of gold and silver basins of a second sort, 410, and other vessels 1,000. And all the vessels of gold and of silver were 5,400, and all these did Sheshbazzar bring up with them of the captivity that were brought up from Babylon unto Jerusalem. And so these are... there's a lot of stuff here, and they're referred to in 2 Kings 24 and 25, Jeremiah 27, 52. In many of the scriptures you'll find cross-referenced in most Bibles. And so ends that chapter. Ezra chapter 2. In Ezra chapter 1, by the way, these actually total about 2,500, or 2,499, but the gold and silver items are listed as 5,400. Why is the difference? I don't think Ezra made a mistake. He was a careful scribe. But some people think that maybe a scribe made it change later, or other, he just listed the more important ones, you follow me, and then gave you a summary. There's another problem, by the way, I should mention just as we go here. There's this guy, Sheshbazzar, mentioned. And he was called a prince of Judah in verse 8. There are no less than 4 views as to who this guy is. And I'm not going to try, it's not a big deal, but at least I want you to be aware of it. See, some people feel that Sheshbazzar is the Persian name for Zerubbabel, who's the key leader for the Jews. And both are said to have led the foundation of the temple in chapter 3 and chapter 5. Zerubbabel's name means begotten in Babel, and born there, in other words. And so he was a grandson of King Jehoiachin, who had been deported but then finally released from confinement. Remember 2 Kings 25. The guy that was called Jeconiah and so forth. And incidentally, Zerubbabel is also an ancestor to Joseph, the legal father of Jesus Christ. Now, Zerubbabel's relationship to Jehoiachin would explain why he would have the title Prince of Judah. And that's why some people think that Sheshbazzar is the Persian name for Zerubbabel. And that, to me, is not far-fetched, because you remember Daniel had the name Belteshazzar. Several times in the book of Daniel that name is used, but it's used so you understand that they gave him a Babylonian name. That was their style. It gets more complicated because in 1 Chronicles 3 calls him the son of Pedaiah, which is instead of Shealtiel, which indicates that Shealtiel died childless, and that Pedaiah has contracted levirate marriage with his brother's widow and all of that. That gets into the whole genealogical thing between the two things. I'll leave that go for now. But if Zerubbabel and Sheshbazzar were the two names of the same person, it's interesting that he's never again referred to by the name Sheshbazzar except in Ezra 5 in a couple of verses. Now there's another view that the Sheshbazzar was really a Jew who was appointed governor by Cyrus but died shortly after arriving in Palestine, replaced by Zerubbabel. That's one theory. It's plausible, but there's no evidence for it as such. A third view is that Sheshbazzar was the Shenazar in 1 Chronicles 3, and therefore Zerubbabel's uncle. Again, it's a thin thread. And another view is that Sheshbazzar was a Persian official who sent to oversee the use of the king's money and so forth. And but none of these, I personally lean, it's not a big deal just to be aware of the fact there's some of this ambiguity, but I tend to lean to it probably is Zerubbabel using a Persian name. That's because we have a precedence for that in the book of Daniel. Anyway, in Ezra chapter 2, verse 1. Now these are the children of the province that went up out of the captivity of those which had been carried away, whom Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon had carried away to Babylon, and came again unto Jerusalem and Judah, every one into his city, which came with Zerubbabel. And now there's a list of a whole bunch of these guys for about 60 verses. I thought we'd go through each one and give you the family tree, right? No, relax. I can't even pronounce them. That give you much background on them. Jeshua is sometimes called Joshua. He's a priest, not the Joshua you're thinking of. Nehemiah, of course, we'll hear a lot about. Excuse me. That's not the Nehemiah. That's going to be prominent later. It's a different Nehemiah, incidentally. And by the way, there's a similar list in Nehemiah chapter 7, which records 12 names rather than 11. And there's reason to believe that one of these names, there's probably one that dropped. There's probably 12 here because we're going to give 12 offerings, and there was probably one from each of the 12 tribes, is the conjecture by many scholars. And I won't get into the details of the differences of the lists, so I'll leave that out. But anyway, we have Zariah, Reelaiah, Mordecai, Bilshan, Mispar, Bigvai, Rehum, Baanah, and the number of the men of the people of Israel, the children of Parash, 2,172, the children of Shephatiah, 372, children of Eras, 775, children of Pahath-Moab, of the children of Jeshua and Joab, 2,812, the children of Elam, 1,254, children of Zatu, and it goes on like this. The children of Zekai, 703 score, children of Benai, 642, children of Bebai. And, many modern readers say, why is this in here for us? It may not be important to us, but it probably was incredibly encouraging to those early settlers to have them detailed here. And by the way, the Mordecai in here is not Esther's cousin. That'll be prominent later, who lived in Susa about 60 years after this first return. And the Nehemiah, as I've mentioned, is not the Nehemiah that returned to Jerusalem some 90 years later, you see. So we'll get confused by all of that. But anyway, it goes on like this. Children of Bezai, 323. Children of Zorah, children of Heshon, children of Gebar, children of Bethlehem, 123. And the children of Netophah, 56. And I might mention that these are listed there is an order to this. The first listing was the 18, they were originally the priests, then the 18 families and clans that had clear genealogies. They totaled about 15,604. Then from verse 21 on, we have the listing of inhabitants totaling about 8,500 from 21 towns and villages. And so there is a pattern here, but there isn't any profound insight from them all. And I won't try to mangle the pronunciation of all these. We'll just zip down through. The priests pick up about verse 36. Anyway, on they go. I'm trying to see if there's any particular. Here are the Levites, the singers, the children of Asaph, 128. Children of the porters, the children of Shalom. They are categorized by roles. There's about 4,042, almost 4,300 priests, followed by 341 Levites, and then temple servants, and descendants of the royal servants, and so forth. When you get to the 43, the Nethinims could very well be the descendants of the Gibeonites, which Joshua had made to do task work in Joshua chapter 9. But it goes on with this whole list, and again, you can mispronounce them without my help. As we go through all these. And so we finally get to about the children of the priests in 61. And finally they sought after the register among those that were reckoned by genealogy, but they were not found. Therefore they, as polluted, were put from the priesthood. There were some that couldn't prove their lineage there. And the Tirshatha said unto them that they should not eat of the most holy things till there stood up a priest with the Urim and Thummim. And the whole congregation together was 40 and 2,303 score. Now this Urim and Thummim thing is, you may recall, it's a mystery as to what it literally was. There's all kinds of conjectures, all kinds of attempts to define it. There's also interesting theories, but no one knows what they really were. We do know it was part of the equipment of the high priest. Some people feel it was 2 stones hidden under the breastplate. Some people feel there were games they played with the lights from the menorah against the stones of the breastplate, which had letters on them, little 3-letter representations of each of the 12 tribes. There's all kinds of conjectures. People don't know. It was the way they determined by the Holy Spirit God's direction. And it was certainly somehow associated with the ceremonial dress. But it also seems that God's will could no longer be determined this way after the departure of the Shekinah glory that described in Ezekiel chapters 8 to 11, about 592 BC. So There's no evidence that the Urim and Thummim were still operative with the departure of the Shekinah. You with me? So somehow the Shekinah glory may have been tied to that some way. Anyway, it is what it is. So they had to hope that it would, there would be a priest come that would have the Urim and Thummim. There's no record in Scripture that endured. So the whole congregation together was 42,303 score, beside their servants and maids, of whom there were 7,337. There were among them 200 singing men and singing women. Their horses were 736, their mules 245, their camels 435, their asses 6,000. See, bear in mind, Ezra, who's writing all this, is a scribe. And he's a reckoner. A scribe was both a very careful chronicler, and he also was a teacher. He was qualified to teach. That's going to be important to us later. Now, it's interesting that in terms of this whole tally here, the total returnees is about 49,897. And the larger number may include children. Now, it also may include Jews from the 10 northern tribes that have joined the remnant of the 2 southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin. And so there's a mixture. And it may also include priests who could not delineate their genealogies, as we saw in verse 61 and 62. Now, it's interesting that Ezra's tally is very close to Nehemiah's, that we'll see later. Nehemiah has 45 extra people who are singers. Ezra had 200, but Nehemiah had 245. Some people think maybe this is a scribal error. Somehow there may be a little different reckoning for some reason, but there's several variations that try to account for the difference. Even the animals are counted, interestingly enough. And now the journey from Babylon to Israel is about 900 miles. It took about 4 months. But Ezra doesn't talk about how long the thing took. His focus is on not the people's hardship, but their task of rebuilding. Ezra's focus is on the temple. There's all kinds of interesting things he does not mention that's going on around them. Anyway, some of the chief of the fathers, when they came to the house of the Lord, which is at Jerusalem, offered freely for the house of God to set it up in its place. And they gave after their ability unto the treasure of the work 61,000 drams of gold, 5,000 pounds of silver, and 100 priests' garments. So we're talking about 61,000 drachmas of gold. Anyway, it's a bunch. It's pretty substantial. But the rebuilding of the temple will be far painfully modest compared to Solomon's. When they finally build the temple, they'll cheer and feel good about it, but the old-timers will weep because they remember the real glory of Solomon's temple, and we'll touch on that as we go. So the priests and the Levites and other people, the singers, the porters, and the Nethinims dwelt in the cities, and all the people of Israel in their cities. So they go back. Ezra chapter 3. We squeeze one more in? I think so. And when the 7th month was come, the children of Israel were in the cities. The people gathered themselves together as one man to Jerusalem. They really worked as one. See, they're really pulling together. Then stood up Joshua, the son of Jozadak, and his brethren, the priests, and Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and his brethren, and builded the altar of God of Israel to offer burnt offerings thereon, as it is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. Ezra is emphasizing that they are returning to faithful practice. That the lack of faithful practice is what brought them into captivity in the first place. They seem to have learned their lesson. They set the altar upon its basis, for fear was upon them because of the people of those countries. They offered burnt offerings thereon to the Lord, even burnt offerings morning and evening. They kept also the Feast of Tabernacles, as it is written, and offered the daily burnt offerings by number, according to the custom, as the duty of every one required. So this is, and this is a very big month, because this is where all the big feasts are and so forth, and you can get into our briefing on the Feast of Israel to get the detailed background of all that. It said that they assembled as one man earlier in verse 1 there, and so they all agreed that the project had to begin. They were all pulling together, and we have a list of all the guys helping. Let's just keep moving here. And afterward offered a continual burnt offering, both of the new moons and of all the set feasts of the Lord that were consecrated. Every one of them willingly offered a freewill offering to the Lord. From the first day of the 7th month, that's the first of the 7th would be Tishri, in the civil calendar, began to offer burnt offerings unto the Lord, but the foundation of the temple was not yet laid. They gave also money to the masons and to the carpenters, and meat and drink and oil unto them of Sidon and to them of Tyre, to bring cedar trees from Lebanon to the sea of Joppa, according to the grant that they had of the Cyrus king of Persia. Remember, Solomon had his timbers from Lebanon also. But here they've got the authority of Cyrus that's paying paying for this. And so they ship down from Sidon up north down to Joppa, which was a harbor. Remember, that was the harbor that Jonah left on his ship and all that stuff. And then to bring it up to Jerusalem, up to the hill, up to Jerusalem. Now, in the second year of their coming unto the house of God in Jerusalem, and speaking of the location, the house of God hasn't been built yet. In the second month, when Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel and Joshua the son of Jozadak, and the remnant of the brethren, the priests and the Levites, and all they that were come out of captivity unto Jerusalem, and appointed the Levites from 20 years old and upward to set forward the work of the house of the Lord. Now, those of you that are sharp may notice that's a little different than the rules in the tabernacle. There's a delay of 7 months in here, by the way. That's so they can get organized and so forth. But remember, the age 25 was the minimum age for the tabernacle. They have here the age of only 20 for temple service. It could be for a lot of reasons, not the least of which they probably needed the help. And now remember, Tyre and Sidon were part of the Persian Empire, so Cyrus's authority for these materials were obviously very operative. In Solomon's time, they were paid for by Solomon. Here they're paid for by Cyrus for them. About 24,000 Levites appointed to oversee the work in Solomon's temple, if you may recall. Here they have not 24,000. In Solomon's day, they got 341. You get a feeling of the problem here. They got a very modest opportunity. Then stood Joshua and his sons with his brethren, and Kadmiel and his sons, and the sons of Judah together, and set forward the workmen in the house of God, the sons of Henadad and their sons, and the brethren, the Levites. And so Zerubbabel's appointing the Levites as supervisors of the construction project. The Levites were earlier in charge of the tabernacle, as you call, and in charge of caring for it and transporting it. Now they're involved with the temple construction. And there are three groups of supervisors mentioned here: Joshua and his family, Kadmiel, and the family of Henadad. And when the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, they set the priests in their apparel with the trumpets, and the Levites and the sons of Asaph with cymbals to praise the Lord after the ordinance of David, the king of Israel. So they're following the rules. So they're following the command of Cyrus to get authority to it, but they're following the command of God according to the covenant. That's the thing that Ezra is trying to emphasize here. And so they're careful to follow the traditions of their forefathers when they were rightly related to God. And so they sang together by chorus in praising and giving thanks unto the Lord, because he is good and his mercy endureth forever toward Israel. And all the people shouted with a great shout when they praised the Lord, because of the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. So they just laid the foundation. It's kind of interesting. It says they sang together. What the Hebrew really means is they sang one to another. Antiphonally, in other words. And the very psalm they sung on this occasion apparently was Psalm 136, if you will. And that suggests that they were thinking in terms of Jeremiah's great prophecy in Jeremiah 33, for those that want to track that down. And the song of praise is highly significant because it indicates that the religious leaders were acknowledging that Jehovah was again establishing his loving protection over the nation. The word you'll see often in your King James is mercy. The actual Hebrew word is chesed. And it's God's covenantal, loyal love. It's much more than just mercy in a casual sense. It's his covenantal love, very loyal love, that exists forever with the people of Israel. And now that the temple worship was being established, the people once again recognized God's commitment of his unending covenantal love. Very important dynamic going on here that Ezra is trying to emphasize. But many of the priests and Levites and chief of the fathers, who were ancient men that had seen the first house when the foundation of this house was laid before their eyes, they wept with a loud voice. And many shouted aloud for joy. See, the newcomers thought this is great, but the old-timers remember the old one, and they weep because this is so modest compared to the glory of Solomon. So the people could not discern the noise of the shout of joy from the noise of the weeping of the people, for the people shouted with a loud shout, and the noise was heard afar off. And so ends the chapter 3. And our first session, first immersion, if you will, in the book of Ezra.